Please, thank you. And I want to request it to our General Secretary and the Chairman of the British Board of Scholars to next one it should be go on for the another. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Modiji. Welcome, elders, brothers, sisters. To be appointed the chair of a group of people who have spent such a long period of time delving and researching and performing the most intense sadhana, and to be given the responsibility of trying to create a framework in which they could present the fruits of this enormous sadhana is absolutely an enormous honor. And so I'd just like to start by thanking the executive of the National Council for entrusting me and for encouraging and motivating me and supporting me to start and continue with this initiative. So thank you so much for that. You may have seen on the... That's okay. Right. It may be easier if you come through the door at the end. There are seats at the other end of the hall. We've had a few spontaneous outbursts of mantras as we proceeded so far, and I feel a mantra coming on, so just to keep the spirit of things alive. Om Asato Ma Sat Gamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya Mrityo Ma Mritam Gamaya Om. May we be guided from unreality to reality, Asato Ma Sat Gamaya, Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya, and may we move from darkness to illumination and light. And sometimes you have to struggle to move from darkness to illumination and light, bearing in mind the lighting of the diya, but we got there. Mrityo Ma Amritam Gamaya. And may we move from an awareness of death to an awareness of immortality. Those three represent for me the ethos and the purpose of what the British Board of Hindu Scholars is about. If you consider the whole of our ancient literature, scholarship and religious scriptures, those three, I've always felt, encapsulate everything that we're trying to achieve. So today is a day of celebrating both scholarship of the past and also inviting and encouraging and supporting Hindu scholarship for the future. And so the role that scholars have played throughout history, I think, is often overlooked. And the busier and the more hurly-burly life becomes, scholarship tends to disappear in the background in our awareness. I'm wanting to change that today. The title and the theme for today is The Elephant Speaks. And many of you will have spotted that we have Ganeshji seated, presiding over the events today. And the theme of the elephant will crop up from time to time as we go through. But I thought I'd start with a poem that it was derived from an old story in the Panchtantra in Indian literature. And it's as follows. And it's to do with an elephant, and it's very pertinent to the whole area of British and Hindu scholarship and the interaction between the two. And the poem goes as follows. It was 6 men of Hindustan to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy the mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall, against his broad and sturdy side at once began to bawl. Bless me, it seems, the elephant is very like a wall. The second, feeling of his tusk, cried, Ho, what have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp, to meet is mighty clear. The wonder of an elephant is very like a spear. The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, then boldly up and spake, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a snake. The fourth reached out an eager hand and felt about the knee. What most this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain, quoth he. 'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree. The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, even the blindest man can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can, the marvel of an elephant is very like a fan. The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a rope. And so these men of Hindustan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and yet all were in the wrong. So the thought occurred to me that the body of scholarship that we have in India has encountered many people who were partial in their vision, and groping around amongst the scriptures, they derived a sense of understanding of what perhaps each little part of dharma or vidya they had encountered, and then they drew their own conclusions. Okay, so I just had an old-fashioned tweet. Okay, and it's I can manage this. Okay, thank you for that. Please ask the younger members to feel free to tweet the proceedings if they so feel inclined. So I've tweeted out to you. Is that what it's called? A tweet out or something? Okay, thank you for that. A shout out. Thank you, Rob. Okay. So I thought, if one were to think of the body of Hindu scholarship as this elephant, and its encounter with people who had never come across an elephant before, what would it have to say to them? And so if that elephant were to actually identify itself and say, this is what I am, what would it say to those scholars and those travellers who came and encountered the body of knowledge that we have, but only ever partially? So the theme today proposes that the body of our scholarship is like an elephant, and we've had partial exposure of some parts of it, taken by some people, and then interpreted and then reissued. But behind all of our Hindu scholarship, there is a vision of unity. And unless you have a glimpse of that unity, the knowledge of all of the component legs and the trunk and the fans and the ears and the spears is destined to remain partial. And so that reminds me, it's brought me to the last verse in that poem, which said, "So oft in theologic wars the disputants I ween rail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant that none of them has seen." So we're going to try and address this issue and bring the elephant together through our various talks and conversations that we're going to start off today. And what I've been asked and tasked and have accepted to do is to talk on the subject of sacred cows. So, sacred cows is a phrase that's been associated with Sanatana Dharma ever since the Europeans came and encountered India. And what they saw was, apparently to them, it was Hindus engaged in the worship of a cow. Hence the term sacred cow. Now the expression was, as was the norm at this stage, a derogatory and slightly condescending expression, and it's never actually used in a respectful manner. When something is referred to as a sacred cow, the implication is that somebody is worshipping an object which is not sacred, and therefore it's demeaning to the person who is engaged in the worship of a sacred cow. And it's normally exclusively associated with Hinduism. But we have an awful lot of sacred cows around and about, wandering and roaming through our minds and through our cultures. And so we're going to have a look at some of these sacred cows and see whether we can identify where the problems lie with these sacred cows. Our proposition is that any concept which is contrary to both reason and the harmonious existence of all of humanity might be a sacred cow, and it might be worthy of scrutiny, and if necessary, it might be worthy of being put out to pasture. At this time in history, we have a huge number of... at this time in history, there is almost not a day goes by without news of a new war or a new conflict or a new ideology-based dispute, or even worse, we have at this moment in time incarceration where people are imprisoned because of beliefs. We also have premeditated genocide being perpetrated at this moment in time. And what I'd like to do is just touch on some of the sacred cows that are behind these, and possibly submit a dharmic solution which is a prerequisite to moving forward towards more harmony. And Hindus have known for millennia that the subject of worship and the act of worship are actually a lot more important than the object of worship. This is why Hindus have an innate propensity, an innate ability to worship almost anything and everything under the sun, including the sun as well. And so the essential difference in dharmic approach is that we do not require anybody. We do not impose upon anybody else the mode of worship that they actually wish to engage in. And behind this, there is a deeply scholarly and respectful attitude, which is fundamental to Sanatana Dharma. The aspect of not imposing one's own ideas, beliefs, experiments upon anybody else. It's apparent, if you just look around the world, that divinity loves diversity. There must be billions and billions of flowers on the planet. You just look at the red roses on the planet, not one of them is identical to any other. So divinity and diversity are they're natural partners, and they're very much a strong part of this. So the search for uniformity is possibly a sacred cow worthy of exploration. Not too long ago, another sacred cow was the concept that the earth was flat. And that should a person be foolish enough to sail westwards, they would fall off into oblivion. This was the dearly held belief for the established power brokers, and they defended this sacred cow for over 200 years, killing and incarcerating scholars, the best minds of the known world at that time, in defense of a wholly unsubstantiated sacred cow, that the earth was flat. The principle of heliocentricity was introduced, and that also received the same response. Heliocentricity being that the earth and the planets rotate around the sun, and not that the earth is the center of the known universe and everything rotates around it, which was the sacred cow prior to that proposition. The scholars who submitted those were courageous, and they actually stood and went against the norm and the status quo. And it took an enormous amount of courage for them to shift 200 years of efforts of scholars to shift from a sacred cow towards a genuine, reasoned understanding of the manner in which and the place in which we live. History has taught us, sadly, that in the West, the appreciation and respect for scholarship in the past was not as worthy and as respectful as it could have been. I can't help but wonder what a multi-faith community existing at the time would have looked like. Because we have a multi-faith community here, which we're very much actively engaged in. And if Galileo's time had been such, and there was a multi-faith community there, it would have been an interesting point in history to observe how they responded to it. I can imagine Copernicus saying, we know that religious leaders are saying that the earth is flat, but we've proven it's round. How can you expect us to unknow this? How do you expect us to live as though it were flat, now that we know that it is not? And this is the conflict that happens when scholars are deprived of the freedom to express fearlessly what it is that they have discovered through their endeavors. How would multi-faith leaders and religious leaders have acted at that time? I have a sense they might have done everything and anything possible but to address the core issue of this sacred cow. Would they have had conferences and seminars and talked about everything under the sun except confront the new and fully reasoned reality submitted by the scholars, that the earth rotated around the sun? No doubt many who had cooperated with the powers that be of that time might even have received generous grants and recognition and been hailed even as community leaders, appointed as heads of think tanks in ancient Rome, and champions of the dialogue between different faiths. One can only guess. But one thing is sure, 200 years plus of European scientific and social progress was held back by blind adherence to this sacred cow, that the earth was flat. So where are we now? Is humanity still blindly worshipping sacred cows? I would like to submit a proposal that there are two sacred cows which for the last 1500 years have prevented the tranquil evolution of humanity from progressing, and blind adherence to these sacred cows has arrested the evolution towards loving community across the globe. The first sacred cow, which I'm putting forward as a proposition, is that only members of a particular religious tradition have a place in heaven, and all others are destined to burn in hell for all of eternity. For those who worship this sacred cow, there is no other choice and no other destination. This sacred cow proposes that Gandhiji is in hell, Buddha is in hell, all of the Jain Tirthankars are in hell, all of the Sikh gurus are in hell, all of the Japanese and Chinese Zen masters, and indeed all of my ancestors, and the ancestors of many people in this room, are also in hell, and those who are here are destined to burn in hell in perpetuity. So I would suggest that this is a sacred cow, which scholars and reason are the only solution to moving this forward. It requires a great deal of courage. A second sacred cow which I would put before you is that only men have a guiding and leading role to play in the journey of humanity towards connecting with the divine. Assuming this to be true, let us know these men by their works. For the last 1500 years, history and the current climate would seem to indicate that the powers that are proposing this particular sacred cow and supporting it have not made a good job of it. This much is self-evident, and this can no longer be ignored. And unless women are immediately granted full authority as equals in all aspects of religious life, all talk of gender equality is lacking in integrity. This is the second sacred cow, which I would suggest is worthy of having a look at. Vox populi, vox deus, the voice of the people is the voice of God. And the vast majority of humanity is tired of worshipping these two irrational sacred cows. And this is evidenced by the volume of legislation which is anti-discriminatory, anti-gender prejudice that is being passed throughout the world. That is the people saying we want to move beyond this particular sacred cow. If we think back to the time of Galileo, if one religious group is insisting that the earth is flat, and the other is insisting that it's in fact dodecahedral, how is this to be resolved? There is one solution, and that solution is that one of them destroys the other by force, in which case allowing one dominant sacred cow to rule. The second is the willingness to accept scholarly, rational, compassionate communication, and that is the path to survival. This is how critical scholars are at this particular time. In the words of Henry Thoreau, the calmness and gentleness with which Hindu philosophers and scholars approach and discourse on forbidden themes is admirable. So I would recommend and suggest that with the formation of the BBHS, the community of Hindu scholars, invite all scholars openly and fearlessly of other traditions to engage and to pursue a scholarly understanding of these sacred cows first and foremost, so that we can then move forward beyond these sacred cows. It is not possible for the earth to be flat and spherical and dodecahedral at the same time. Thank you so much. That's my keynote speech. And so you youngsters, I hail you as the courageous scholars who are going to bring this into a reality.